The black credit card felt like fire in Rebecca Collins's trembling hands as she walked through the harsh February wind cutting through downtown Austin. Behind her, though she didn't know it, 3 men in dark suits followed at a careful distance, their earpieces crackling with updates for the billionaire watching from his penthouse 40 floors above. James Hartford adjusted his telescope and spoke into his phone. "She's been walking for 20 minutes now. Where is she going with my card?" His voice carried the weight of a man who had never been surprised by human nature, who expected the worst and was rarely disappointed. The 17-year-old girl clutched her thin jacket tighter as she passed the gleaming tech offices and trendy coffee shops that filled this part of the city. Her worn sneakers squelched against the wet pavement, and her stomach cramped from hunger she'd learned to ignore. 3 days ago, she had been invisible to people like James Hartford. 3 days ago, she had been just another face in the crowd of Austin's forgotten. But then she had found his wallet. James remembered that moment with crystal clarity. He had been rushing from his Tesla to a board meeting when the leather billfold slipped from his coat pocket. He hadn't even noticed until the young woman tapped his shoulder. "Excuse me, sir. You dropped this." Her eyes had been clear and honest, her smile genuine despite the obvious signs of hardship written across her face. Most people would have kept the wallet, or at least expected a reward. But Rebecca had simply handed it over and started to walk away. That's when James had made his decision. "Wait," he had called after her. He pulled out his emergency credit card, the one with no limit, the one connected directly to his personal fortune. "Take this." She had stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. "I don't understand." "Consider it a test," he had said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was testing. "Use it however you see fit. I'll know if you're worthy of trust." Now, watching her through his telescope, James felt that familiar cynicism creeping in. Everyone had a price. Everyone had a breaking point where their true nature showed itself. He had built his empire on that knowledge, on understanding that people would always choose self-interest when pushed far enough. His phone buzzed. "Sir, she's entering Thompson's Grocery on 6th Street. James leaned forward, adjusting his view. Through the large windows of the modest store, he could see Rebecca standing inside, the card still clutched in her hand. She hadn't used it yet. For 73 minutes, she had carried the power to buy anything she wanted, and she hadn't spent a single dollar. "Interesting," James murmured. But he knew this was just the beginning. The real test would come when temptation grew too strong to resist. Down in the store, Rebecca stared at the shelves of food surrounding her. Her mouth watered at the sight of fresh fruit, real meat, anything more substantial than the day-old bread and soup kitchen meals she'd survived on for months. The card in her hand could buy all of it. The strange man had said to use it however she saw fit. But something held her back. Rebecca thought about the other faces at the shelter where she slept. Maria, the single mother with 2 kids who never had enough diapers. Old Pete, whose diabetes medication cost more than he could panhandle in a week. Jenny, barely older than Rebecca herself, who had been on the streets since aging out of foster care. She thought about Pastor Tom, who ran the shelter on donations that never stretched far enough. About the community kitchen that served watery soup because meat was too expensive. About the dozens of people who had shown her kindness when the world had given up on her. A store employee approached her. The woman's name tag read Monica, and her smile seemed genuine. "Can I help you find anything, honey?" Rebecca looked at Monica's kind face and made her first decision. "Yes. I need to buy some things. But not for me." Monica's eyebrows raised slightly, but her smile never wavered. "What kind of things?" "Food, medicine, supplies." Rebecca held up the credit card. "For people who need it more than I do." As Rebecca began to fill her cart with necessities, James watched from above, his cynicism beginning to crack. This wasn't the behavior he had expected. This wasn't the greed and self-interest he had spent decades watching people display. His phone rang. It was Richard Stone, his business partner and the man who had advised him against this social experiment from the beginning. "How's your test going, James? Has you maxed out the card on designer clothes and expensive dinners yet?" James watched Rebecca carefully reading labels, choosing generic brands over name brands, selecting items based on need rather than want. "Not exactly, Richard. Give her time. They all show their true colors eventually." But as James watched Rebecca approach the checkout counter with a cart full of basic necessities, none of them for herself, he began to wonder if Richard might be wrong. And for the first time in years, James Hartford found himself hoping to be surprised. The first chapter of Rebecca's test was complete. But neither she nor James realized that the real test wasn't about her character at all. It was about whether a billionaire's heart could still learn to break open for something other than profit. Do you think Rebecca will continue to put others first, or will temptation eventually win? Subscribe and comment below with your prediction about what happens next. Monica watched the young woman in front of her with growing curiosity. In her 15 years working at Thompson's Grocery, she had seen all types of customers, but Rebecca was different. The girl's hands shook as she placed each item on the conveyor belt, and she kept glancing at the credit card like it might disappear. First time using plastic? Monica asked gently, trying to ease the girl's obvious nervousness. Rebecca nodded. Something like that. She paused, then added, I want to make sure I'm doing this right. The items told a story Monica had seen before. Generic peanut butter, day-old bread marked down for quick sale, the cheapest milk available. But then came the surprises. Children's vitamins, diabetic testing strips, feminine hygiene products, and several bottles of over-the-counter pain medication. Shopping for a big family. Monica asked, though something in her gut told her this was more complicated. For people who don't have family to shop for them, Rebecca answered quietly. Monica's hands stilled on the scanner. She had grown up in Austin, had seen the homeless population grow year after year. She recognized the signs now. The girl's too thin frame, the worn clothes, the way she handled money like it was foreign to her. From his penthouse, James pressed his phone closer to his ear as his security team relayed the conversation. This wasn't making sense. He had given Rebecca access to unlimited funds, and she was buying generic groceries and medical supplies for other people. Sir, the total is approaching $300, came the voice through his earpiece. $300. James spent more than that on lunch most days. He had expected Rebecca to start with something modest, maybe test the limits gradually. But he certainly hadn't expected this. Back in the store, Monica had made a decision. As Rebecca's items finished scanning, Monica quietly added her employee discount to the purchase. There, she said. That'll save you about $30. Rebecca's eyes widened. You don't have to do that. Honey, when someone's trying to help others, I figure the least I can do is help them help. Monica smiled and lowered her voice. Besides, I got a feeling those people you're shopping for could use every dollar they can get. As Rebecca signed the receipt with an uncertain hand, Monica reached under her counter and pulled out a handful of manufacturer coupons. Take these too. Next time you come in, they'll save you even more. Rebecca stared at the coupons like Monica had handed her gold bars. Thank you. Really, thank you so much. Monica helped Rebecca bag her groceries, making sure to double bag the heavier items. You take care of yourself too. You hear? Can't help others if you don't take care of yourself first. But even as Monica said it, she noticed Rebecca hadn't bought a single item for herself. Not one thing that looked like a treat or even a basic personal necessity. Just supplies for other people. As Rebecca left the store, struggling slightly with her heavy bags, Monica made a mental note to watch for her. Something about that girl made Monica want to do more, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. James watched through his telescope as Rebecca walked down 6th Street, the bags weighing her down but her steps somehow lighter than when she had entered the store. His phone was ringing again, but he ignored it. Richard could wait. Where is she going now? James asked his security team. Looks like she's heading toward the river, sir. That's where the emergency shelter is located. The Austin Emergency Shelter. James knew of it, though he had never given it much thought. It was one of those problems that existed on the edges of his world, something other people dealt with while he focused on stock prices and board meetings. As Rebecca walked, she passed a group of business people leaving an expensive restaurant. Their conversation drifted over to her. Did you see the quarterly reports? Hartford's company is up another 12%. That man could probably buy half the city if he wanted to. Rebecca glanced back at the restaurant, then down at the credit card in her pocket. She wondered briefly who James Hartford was, why he had given her this card. But the wondering passed quickly. Whatever his reasons, she had been given an opportunity to help people who desperately needed help. That was enough for now. Monica finished her shift an hour later, but she couldn't stop thinking about the young woman with the credit card and the selfless shopping list. As she drove home to her small apartment, she made a decision. Tomorrow, she would ask her manager about organizing a food drive for the local shelters. One act of kindness, Monica had learned long ago, had a way of inspiring others. Meanwhile, in his penthouse, James Hartford stared out at the city lights and wondered what he had set in motion. His test was supposed to reveal human nature at its worst. Instead, he was witnessing something he hadn't seen in years: genuine altruism. The credit card had been used for its first purchase, and James's worldview had taken its first crack. Rebecca's bags grew heavier with each step, but her heart felt lighter than it had in months. She was about to discover that kindness, like ripples in water, never stayed contained in just one place. Pastor Tom Williams looked up from his paperwork as Rebecca pushed through the heavy doors of the Austin Emergency Shelter, her arms loaded with grocery bags. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the main room, where 24 people sat on folding chairs and worn couches, trying to escape the February cold. Rebecca. Pastor Tom stood, concern creasing his weathered face. Where did you get the money for all that? The room fell quiet. Maria looked up from trying to keep her 2-year-old son entertained with a torn picture book. Old Pete paused in his careful rationing of his remaining insulin. Jenny stopped brushing her hair, the only luxury she allowed herself each day. Rebecca set the bags on the communal table, her cheeks flushed from the cold and the weight of her purchases. Someone gave me a chance to help. I couldn't think of anywhere else to start. From his high-rise office, James watched the security footage his team was streaming to his phone. The shelter's interior was sparse but clean, filled with people who had nowhere else to go. He recognized the look in their eyes, though he had never experienced it himself. It was the careful hope of people who had learned not to expect too much from the world. What's in the bags? Pastor Tom asked gently. He had been running this shelter for 8 years, and he had seen every kind of every angle people worked when they were desperate. But Rebecca had been staying here for 3 weeks, and she had never asked for special treatment or tried to take more than her share. Rebecca began unpacking. Diapers for Maria's kids. Insulin testing strips for Pete. Some pain medication for anyone who needs it. She pulled out loaves of bread, jars of peanut butter, and gallons of milk. And food for everyone. The room erupted in surprised voices. Maria started crying when she saw the package of diapers. Pete held the testing strips like they were precious jewels. Jenny just stared in disbelief. How? Pastor Tom asked. Rebecca, these supplies cost hundreds of dollars. Rebecca pulled the black credit card from her pocket, and several people gasped. Credit cards were myths to most people in this room, symbols of a financial system they had been locked out of long ago. A man gave this to me after I returned his wallet. He said to use it however I saw fit. Rebecca looked around the room at the faces of people who had become her family over the past few weeks. This seemed like the right way. James felt something twist in his chest as he watched the scene unfold. Through his security feed, he could see the pure joy on people's faces. When had he last seen joy that wasn't connected to profit margins or stock prices? His phone buzzed with a text from Richard. She's probably selling the stuff for drug money. This is exactly why you can't trust these people. But James was watching Maria hug her children with tears streaming down her face, watching Pete carefully put away his testing strips like they were going to save his life, which they probably would. This didn't look like a con. This looked like something James had forgotten existed. Pastor Tom gathered the group together. Let's say grace before we eat. Rebecca, would you like to lead us? Rebecca shook her head quickly. I'm not good with words like that. Then I'll do it, Pastor Tom said. He bowed his head, and the others followed. Lord, we thank you for Rebecca's generous heart and for the stranger who made this possible. Help us remember that kindness multiplies when we share it. Amen. As the group began preparing a communal meal with Rebecca's purchases, James found himself thinking about prayer for the first time in decades. His parents had been religious people, but success had gradually erased those childhood memories. Now, watching strangers share food and hope, he wondered what else he had lost along the way. Old Pete shuffled over to Rebecca as she helped distribute sandwiches. "Girl, I don't know what angel sent you that card, but you used it right. These testing strips will keep me healthy for 2 months." "That's what they are for," Rebecca smiled, though James could see the exhaustion in her face through the security feed. Jenny approached next. "Rebecca, you didn't buy anything for yourself. Not even a candy bar." Rebecca shrugged. "I had everything I needed already." But James could see that wasn't true. Rebecca's clothes were threadbare, her shoes had holes that let in the February cold, and she looked like she had missed more meals than she had eaten. She had access to unlimited funds and had used them for everyone but herself. The realization hit James like a physical blow. This wasn't a test of Rebecca's character anymore. It was revealing something about his own. As evening fell and the shelter prepared for the night, Rebecca pulled Pastor Tom aside. "There's more I want to do with this card. More people I can help." Pastor Tom studied her face carefully. "Rebecca, generous hearts are beautiful things, but you need to be careful. Someone doesn't just hand out unlimited credit cards without expecting something back." "Maybe," Rebecca said. "But until I figure out what he wants, I'm going to help as many people as I can." James turned away from his telescope, his hands trembling slightly. In all his years of business, in all his careful calculations about human nature, he had never accounted for this. He had never planned for someone who would sacrifice everything for strangers. The test was supposed to prove that everyone had a price. Instead, it was proving that some people's price was measured in other people's well-being. For the first time in his adult life, James Hartford was learning that he might be wrong about everything he thought he knew about human nature. And Rebecca Collins was just getting started. By morning, word had spread through Austin's homeless community like wildfire. Rebecca had become a legend overnight, the girl with the mysterious credit card who put everyone else first. As she walked through downtown with Pastor Tom, people approached her with desperate hope in their eyes. Rebecca called out a man named Calvin who usually slept behind the library. "Is it true? You really got a way to help people." Pastor Tom watched carefully as a small crowd gathered around them. He had seen this before. When rumors of help spread, it could create dangerous situations. Desperate people sometimes did desperate things. But Rebecca handled the attention with remarkable grace. "I can help some," she said honestly. "But I need to be smart about it." From his penthouse, James watched the scene unfold with growing amazement. His security team had counted 47 people who had approached Rebecca since sunrise. She spoke to each one, listened to their stories, and made careful mental notes about their needs. "Sir," came the voice through his earpiece, "she's entering the Salvation Army thrift store." James adjusted his telescope focus. Inside the store, Rebecca was systematically going through the racks, but not for herself. She was selecting interview clothes, clean button-down shirts, simple slacks, modest dresses, and decent shoes. All in different sizes. The store manager, a middle-aged woman named Carol, approached Rebecca. "Finding everything you need, dear." "I'm shopping for other people," Rebecca explained. "Job interviews. They need to look professional." Carol's eyes lit up with understanding. "Oh, honey, let me help you with that. We get donations from some of the business districts. I know exactly what employers around here like to see." For the next 2 hours, Carol helped Rebecca select appropriate interview outfits for a dozen different people. When they reached the checkout, Carol applied every discount available and even marked down several items as damaged when they clearly weren't. "That'll be $437, Carol said. Rebecca handed over the credit card without hesitation. As Carol processed the payment, she asked quietly, "What you're doing, it's really something special. We don't see much of this kind of generosity." "Everyone deserves a chance," Rebecca replied simply. James felt that now familiar twist in his chest. The girl was spending money like she had been doing it her whole life, but only on other people. His security team reported that she hadn't purchased a single item for herself since receiving the card. Richard Stone appeared in James's office unannounced, his face flushed with anger. "James, this has gone too far. Your little street girl has spent over $1,000 in 24 hours. "I know," James said quietly, not looking away from his telescope. "You know? That's all you have to say." Richard moved closer to the window. She's probably working with a whole network of con artists. They are going to bleed you dry and disappear. James finally turned to face his business partner. Look at the security footage, Richard. Tell me what you see. Reluctantly, Richard glanced at the monitors, showing various camera feeds of Rebecca's activities. On screen, they could see her at the thrift store, carefully selecting clothes for people who weren't even with her. I see someone who's very good at looking innocent, Richard said coldly. But James saw something else. He saw a 17-year-old girl who could have bought herself a feast and new clothes and a warm hotel room. Instead, she was ensuring that people she barely knew would have a chance at job interviews. After leaving the thrift store, Rebecca made stops at 3 budget motels around the city. At each one, she paid for rooms for different homeless individuals, but only for specific nights when they had job interviews scheduled. The desk clerk at the first motel, a tired-looking man named Eddie, seemed confused by the arrangement. So you're paying for rooms for people who aren't with you. They have job interviews, Rebecca explained patiently. They need somewhere to shower and get ready properly. Eddie had worked in budget motels for 12 years. He had seen every scam, every angle, every way people tried to work the system. But this made no sense as a con. The girl was paying full price for rooms she wouldn't use, for people she barely knew. When do they check in? Eddie asked. Rebecca pulled out a carefully handwritten list. Mr. Peterson tomorrow at 3 p.m. He has an interview at the auto shop on Thursday morning. Ms. Rodriguez on Friday. She's trying for the receptionist job at the dental office. As Eddie processed the payments, he found himself inspired by Rebecca's systematic kindness. When she left, he made a decision to hold those rooms even if other customers offered more money. Some things were more important than profit. By afternoon, Rebecca had spent nearly $2,000, and James was experiencing emotions he hadn't felt in decades. Pride, wonder, and something that might have been hope. But he was also beginning to feel something else, fear. Not fear of financial loss, but fear that he had unleashed something he wouldn't be able to control. Rebecca's generosity was inspiring other people to act with kindness. The ripple effects were spreading beyond what he had anticipated. The test had taken on a life of its own, and James was no longer sure who was being tested. What would you do if someone gave you unlimited money? Would you choose to help others like Rebecca, or would temptation win? Subscribe and comment with your thoughts. Your answer might surprise you. Betty Sue Thornton had run her diner on East Austin's Rosewood Avenue for 32 years. She had seen the neighborhood change, watched families struggle, and served coffee to everyone from construction workers to college students. But she had never seen anything quite like what walked through her door on Wednesday morning. Rebecca entered with 3 people behind her: Calvin, who usually slept behind the library, Maria with her 2 young children, and an older woman named Dorothy, who had been living in her car since losing her apartment. All 4 were dressed in the clean, professional clothes Rebecca had bought the day before. Table for 4, please, Rebecca said politely. Betty Sue sized up the group with experienced eyes. She had learned to spot trouble, to read people who might not be able to pay their bills. But something about this odd collection of people intrigued her. From his office, James watched through his security team's feed as Rebecca ordered breakfast for everyone, but not for herself. She sat quietly while the others ate, occasionally sipping water and checking her handwritten list. Excuse me, Betty Sue approached their table. I couldn't help but notice you folks seem to be preparing for something important. Calvin looked up from his eggs and toast. Job interviews, he said proudly. This young lady here made it possible for us to have a real chance. Betty Sue's interest sharpened. What kind of jobs? Auto repair shop for me, Calvin continued. I got 20 years of experience, but haven't been able to present myself right for interviews. Maria spoke up quietly. I'm trying for the receptionist position at Dr. Martinez's dental office. My kids and I really need this. Dorothy nodded. Housekeeping at the Marriott. It's honest work, and the pay is decent. Betty Sue found herself genuinely moved by their determination. As a small business owner, she understood the challenge of finding reliable employees. She also understood how hard it was for people without addresses or proper interview clothes to get a fair chance. She pulled up a chair. You know what? I might have something that could help. Rebecca looked up from her list. What do you mean? I've been needing help here at the diner. Morning prep cook, dishwasher, maybe someone who's good with customers." Betty Sue looked around the table. "You folks seem like the kind of people who understand the value of work." The excitement around the table was palpable. Calvin straightened up. "I can cook. Been doing it for years at the shelter when they'll let me. And I'm good with cleaning and organizing," Dorothy added hopefully. Betty Sue smiled. "Why don't you all finish your interviews first? See how those go. But if anyone needs work after that, come back and talk to me." As Betty Sue walked away, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the simple joy of being able to help. Rebecca's generosity was infectious, creating opportunities where none had existed before. Meanwhile, across town at Henderson's auto repair, shop owner Frank Henderson was having an unusual morning. He had received a call from a young woman asking if he would consider giving Calvin Matthews a fair interview, despite his current housing situation. "He has 20 years of experience," Rebecca had explained over the phone. "He just needs someone to give him a chance." Frank had been reluctant at first. Hiring homeless individuals came with complications: no permanent address, no way to ensure they'd show up consistently, potential issues with other employees. But something in the young woman's voice had convinced him to agree to the interview. When Calvin arrived that afternoon, Frank was surprised. The man was clean, professionally dressed, and carried himself with quiet dignity. His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct. "Tell me about your experience," Frank said, settling behind his desk. Calvin's knowledge was impressive. He could diagnose engine problems by sound, understood both domestic and foreign vehicle systems, and had clearly worked with his hands his whole life. But it was something else that convinced Frank to take a chance. "Mr. Henderson," Calvin said near the end of the interview, "I know my situation ain't ideal. But I want you to know that a young lady put her faith in me to be here today. She spent her own money to make sure I could present myself right. I won't let her down, and I won't let you down either." Frank hired him on the spot. At Dr. Martinez's dental office, Maria's interview was going equally well. Dr. Martinez had been impressed by her punctuality, her careful attention to his questions, and her obvious care in how she presented herself. "You have children?" Dr. Martinez asked. "Two," Maria answered honestly. "A 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. But I have reliable childcare arranged, and I'm committed to being here when you need me." Dr. Martinez studied her application. "Maria, I have to ask, how did you manage to get interview clothes and childcare arranged so quickly? When my receptionist called you yesterday, you mentioned some challenges with resources." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "A girl at the shelter where we're staying gave me a chance. She bought me these clothes, paid for my children to stay in a safe place during this interview, and convinced me I was worth taking a chance on." Dr. Martinez hired her that afternoon. Back at the diner, Betty Sue found herself thinking about the morning's encounters. She made a decision that would change several lives. She called the shelter and asked to speak with Pastor Tom. "I want to set up a partnership," she told him. "People who are trying to get back on their feet can work here part-time while they look for permanent positions. It'll give them work experience, references, and steady income." Pastor Tom was amazed. "Betty Sue, that's incredibly generous." "Wasn't my idea originally," Betty Sue admitted. "Got inspired by a young lady who came in here today. Sometimes it takes seeing real kindness to remember what we're all supposed to be doing for each other." By evening, Rebecca's simple act of sharing resources had created a network of opportunity that was transforming lives throughout the community. James watched the reports from his security team with growing wonder. Calvin had a job. Maria had a job. Dorothy's interview at the Marriott had led to a position in housekeeping. And Betty Sue's diner was becoming an unofficial employment pipeline for people transitioning out of homelessness. But the most remarkable part wasn't the individual successes. It was how Rebecca's generosity had inspired others to be generous. Betty Sue hadn't just offered jobs. She had created a program. Dr. Martinez hadn't just hired Maria. He had recommended her to colleagues who needed reliable employees. Frank Henderson had called other auto shop owners to suggest giving homeless individuals fair chances at interviews. Kindness was multiplying throughout the city, and it all traced back to one 17-year-old girl who had chosen to put everyone else first. James turned away from his monitors and looked out at the city lights. For the first time in decades, Austin looked different to him. Instead of seeing buildings and traffic and profit centers, he was seeing a community of people who could lift each other up when given the chance. The test had revealed human nature, all right. But it wasn't the selfish, greedy nature he had expected to find. Richard Stone stormed into James's office at 7 in the morning, his face red with anger and a stack of papers clutched in his hands. "This ends now, James. Your little social experiment is about to destroy everything we've built." James looked up from his coffee, still wearing yesterday's clothes. He had spent the night watching security feeds and reading reports about Rebecca's activities. Sleep had become impossible as he witnessed the ripple effects of generosity spreading through the city. "What are you talking about, Richard?" Richard slammed the papers down on James's desk. "Credit card statements. Your homeless girl has spent over $8,000 in 5 days. But that's not the real problem." "Then what is?" "I did some digging. Rebecca Collins isn't just some innocent street kid." Richard's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "She's been in the foster system since she was 12. Multiple placements, kicked out of 3 homes for behavioral issues. She has a juvenile record for shoplifting." James felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of behavioral issues? Lying, manipulation, stealing from foster families. Richard pulled out a file folder. "James, she's playing you. This whole act is designed to make you feel sorry for her so she can drain your accounts." The papers showed Rebecca's history. Bounced between 7 foster homes, arrested twice for minor theft, aged out of the system at 17 with nowhere to go. The picture Richard painted was of a troubled teenager who had learned to survive by manipulating kind-hearted adults. "Look at this objectively," Richard continued. "She spends just enough on other people to look generous, but she's building credibility so she can eventually make larger purchases for herself. It's a long con, James." From his window, James could see Rebecca walking toward the shelter with bags of groceries. Even from 40 stories up, he could see the exhaustion in her posture, the way she struggled with the weight of supplies she'd bought for others. "She hasn't bought anything for herself," James said quietly. "Yet," Richard emphasized. "But she will. They always do." He leaned across the desk. "James, I've contacted our legal team. We can have her arrested for credit card fraud before she does any more damage." "She's not committing fraud. I gave her the card voluntarily. Under false pretenses. She manipulated you with the wallet incident, made herself look trustworthy so you'd give her access to your finances." Richard's voice grew more urgent. "I've also talked to some media contacts. We can frame this as a cautionary tale about street criminals who prey on successful businessmen. It'll protect your reputation and warn others." James turned back to the window. Below, Rebecca had stopped to help an elderly homeless man who had fallen on the sidewalk. She set down her heavy bags and carefully helped him to his feet, checking to make sure he wasn't injured. "What if you're wrong?" James asked. "I'm not wrong. I've seen this pattern dozens of times in our business dealings. People show you their best face until they get what they want. Then the mask comes off." Richard moved closer to the window. "Look, I know you want to believe in human goodness, but this girl is using your idealism against you." The intercom buzzed. James's secretary announced, "Mr. Hartford, there's a Pastor Tom Williams here to see you. He says it's about Rebecca Collins." James and Richard exchanged glances. "Send him in," James said. Pastor Tom entered the office looking uncomfortable in his simple dark suit. He was clearly out of place in the marble and glass environment, but his bearing was dignified. "Mr. Hartford," Pastor Tom said, extending his hand. "I believe you're the man who gave Rebecca the credit card." "How did you know?" James asked. "Rebecca described you. More importantly, she's been worried about finding you to thank you properly." Pastor Tom looked between James and Richard. "I came here because I thought you should know what your generosity has accomplished." Richard stepped forward. "Pastor Williams, I think you should know that Rebecca Collins has a history of being failed by every adult who was supposed to protect her," Pastor Tom interrupted firmly. "Yes, I know her history. I also know who she is now." Pastor Tom pulled out his phone and showed them photos. Rebecca helping in the shelter's kitchen. Rebecca reading to Maria's children. Rebecca organizing donations and ensuring fair distribution to everyone who needed help. Mr. Hartford, in 3 weeks of living at our shelter, Rebecca never asked for special treatment or extra resources. She shared her food with hungrier people, gave up her bed to families with children, and volunteered for every cleaning duty. Pastor Tom put his phone away. When you gave her that card, you gave her the first real power she'd ever had in her life. And she chose to use it for others. But her juvenile record, Richard began, shows a child who stole food because she was hungry and basic supplies because no adult was providing them, Pastor Tom said sharply. Context matters, Mr. Stone. Rebecca learned to survive in a system that failed her repeatedly. But survival instincts and character are different things. James found himself studying the pastor's face. There was something about the man's quiet conviction that carried weight. Pastor Williams, James said carefully, if I asked you whether Rebecca could be trusted with unlimited resources, what would you say? I'd say she's already answered that question. But I'd also say that trust shouldn't be unlimited for anyone, especially not for a 17-year-old who's been on her own since she was 12. Pastor Tom looked directly at James. She needs guidance, not temptation. She needs support, not tests. After Pastor Tom left, Richard turned to James with satisfaction. You see? Even he admits she shouldn't have unlimited access to money. But James had heard something else in the pastor's words. Not a warning about Rebecca's character, but concern for her well-being. The difference was significant. As the day wore on, James found himself torn between Richard's cynical warnings and his own observations of Rebecca's behavior. The evidence of her troubled past was real. But so was the evidence of her current generosity. By evening, James had made his decision about what to do next. But he wasn't sure yet whether that decision would save Rebecca Collins or destroy her. The test had become more complicated than he had ever imagined. And the stakes were higher than either of them realized. Rebecca stared at the eviction notice posted on the shelter's front door, her hands trembling as she read the legal language that would displace 68 people in 10 days. Pastor Tom stood beside her, his face gray with exhaustion and worry. How much? Rebecca asked quietly. $47,000 in back property taxes, Pastor Tom replied. The city's been patient, but they can't wait anymore. If we don't pay by Monday, everyone here loses their only safe place. Rebecca pulled out the black credit card, its weight somehow heavier than it had been a week ago. She had spent carefully, strategically, helping individuals find jobs and secure basic necessities. But $47,000 was more than she had spent in total since receiving the card. From his penthouse, James watched through his security cameras as Rebecca and Pastor Tom stood outside the shelter. His phone was buzzing constantly with calls from Richard, who was pushing harder each day for legal action against Rebecca. Sir, came the voice through his earpiece, she's entering the city tax office. James adjusted his telescope focus, his heart rate increasing. The tax office was where property owners went to pay municipal debts. If Rebecca was going there with his credit card, she was about to make the largest single purchase since receiving it. Inside the sterile government building, Rebecca approached the payment window. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Sandra, looked up from her paperwork with the weary expression of someone who dealt with financial desperation daily. How can I help you? Sandra asked. I need to pay property taxes for the Austin Emergency Shelter, Rebecca said, placing the credit card on the counter. Sandra's expression shifted to surprise. Most people who came to pay shelter taxes were representatives from charitable organizations or legal teams. This young woman looked like she belonged more on the receiving end of shelter services than the paying end. Do you have authorization from the property owner? Sandra asked carefully. Rebecca's face fell. She hadn't considered that she might not be allowed to pay someone else's taxes. I just want to help. If the shelter closes, 68 people will have nowhere to go. Sandra studied Rebecca's face, seeing genuine desperation and concern. She had worked in municipal offices for 18 years and had developed a sense for people who were trying to run scams versus those who genuinely wanted to help. Let me check on the exact amount owed, Sandra said, pulling up the account on her computer. Austin Emergency Shelter. Yes, they owe $47,215. Rebecca's breath caught. The number was even higher than Pastor Tom had thought. However, Sandra continued, there's a procedure for third-party payments on behalf of charitable organizations. If you can prove the payment is legitimate and not part of any money laundering scheme, we can process it. How do I prove that? Rebecca asked. Sandra looked at the young woman more carefully. Something about her desperation seemed genuine, and Sandra had seen enough people trying to work financial angles to recognize when someone wasn't running a con. Do you have identification and proof of how you obtained funds for such a large payment? Rebecca showed her ID and explained about the credit card, though she kept the details vague. She couldn't really explain James's test without sounding like she was making up an elaborate story. Sandra made a decision that would change many lives. I'm going to process this payment, but I need you to understand something. $47,000 is not a small amount. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want to do? Rebecca thought about Maria's children, who finally had a safe place to sleep. About Calvin, who was working at the auto shop but still needed the shelter for housing until his first paycheck allowed him to rent a room. About old Pete, whose diabetes was stabilizing now that he had regular access to medication and insulin testing supplies. I'm certain, Rebecca said. As Sandra processed the payment, Rebecca felt something profound shift inside her chest. She was using almost all the remaining credit available on the card. After this purchase, she would have maybe a few $100s left of whatever limit James had set. But the shelter would survive. 68 people would keep their beds, their safety, their hope. From his office, James watched the transaction process in real time through his banking alerts. $47,215. Gone in an instant, used to save a building he had never thought about before this week. His phone rang immediately. It was Richard. James, she just spent nearly $50,000. This has to stop right now. I know, James said quietly. You know? That's all you're going to say. Richard's voice was approaching panic. She's cleaning out your accounts. This is exactly what I warned you about. But James was looking at his security feed, watching Rebecca walk slowly away from the city building. Her shoulders were set with determination, but he could see the weight of what she had just done in her posture. She had used almost all of her access to help others. She hadn't bought herself food or clothes or shelter or any of the things a homeless teenager might desperately need. She had saved a building full of strangers. Richard, James said, I need to meet her. What? James, no. We need to have her arrested before she can do any more damage. She just spent $50,000 to keep a homeless shelter open. What more damage could she possibly do? James hung up the phone and stared out at the city. Somewhere down there, Rebecca Collins was walking back to a shelter that would remain open because she had chosen to sacrifice her last chance at personal gain for the well-being of others. The test was over. James had learned everything he needed to know about human nature. The question now was what he was going to do with that knowledge, and whether Rebecca would forgive him for what he was about to reveal. James Hartford stood in his private elevator, adjusting his tie for the 5th time as the floors counted down toward the lobby. In 42 years of life, he had never been nervous about meeting anyone. CEOs, world leaders, investors with billions at stake, none of them had ever made his hands shake the way they were shaking now. But none of them had been Rebecca Collins. His security team had given him her location. She was sitting on a bench outside the shelter, staring at the credit card she had nearly emptied, saving the building behind her. James had watched her through the cameras for an hour, seeing her shoulders shake with what looked like exhaustion or tears or both. The elevator doors opened, and James stepped onto the Austin street for the first time in months. Usually, he traveled by private car from building to building, never experiencing the city at ground level. Now, walking the 6 blocks to the shelter, he was struck by details he had never noticed from his penthouse view. The smell of food trucks mixing with exhaust fumes. The sound of construction and traffic and human voices led together. The sight of people hurrying to jobs or homes or appointments, each carrying their own invisible stories. And scattered among them, the people he had never really seen before. Individuals sitting in doorways, pushing shopping carts, holding cardboard signs. People Rebecca had chosen to help instead of helping herself. He found her exactly where his security feed had shown her, sitting on a weathered bench outside the Austin emergency shelter. She looked smaller in person, younger and more fragile than she had appeared through his telescope. The credit card lay in her open palm like she couldn't decide whether to put it away or throw it in the trash. "Rebecca," James said softly. She looked up, and he saw her eyes widen with recognition. "You're the man from the street. The one with the wallet." "Yes." James sat down beside her, leaving space between them. "My name is James Hartford." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I figured it out when I started hearing your name around the city. James Hartford, the tech billionaire." She held up the credit card. "I should have known someone like me doesn't just get handed unlimited money." "Why didn't you use it differently?" James asked. "When you realized who I was, why didn't you buy yourself things you needed?" Rebecca looked down at her worn shoes, then back at the shelter behind them. "Because it was never about me. These people," she gestured toward the building where dozens of individuals were preparing for the evening meal. "They didn't choose to be here. Life just kept knocking them down until they had nowhere else to go." James felt something break open in his chest. "But you chose to be here too, in a way. You could have used that card to get an apartment, buy new clothes, eat in restaurants. You could have changed your entire life." "I did change my entire life," Rebecca said quietly. "Just not in the way you probably expected." For several minutes, they sat in silence. James watched the flow of people in and out of the shelter, some leaving for night jobs, others returning from day labor, families gathering their children for dinner. A world he had never really seen before, despite living 40 stories above it. "Rebecca," James said finally, "I need to tell you something about why I gave you that card." She turned to face him, and he saw no anger or judgment in her expression, only curiosity and something that might have been compassion. "I was testing you," James continued. "I wanted to see what someone would do with unlimited resources. I expected you to be selfish, to prove that everyone has a price." Rebecca nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. "And what did you find out?" The question caught James off guard. He had prepared for anger, for accusations, for demands about what would happen next. He hadn't prepared for simple, direct curiosity about his conclusions. "I found out that I was wrong about everything," James said. "About human nature, about what people want, about what really matters." Rebecca smiled, and it was the first time James had seen her look truly happy since he had started watching her. "Good," she said. "Being wrong about something important is how you know you're growing." James stared at her. Here was a 17-year-old girl who had been failed by every system designed to protect her, who had been living on the streets and in shelters, who had just given up her only chance at financial security to save strangers. And she was offering him comfort about his personal growth. "Rebecca, I want to do more. I want to help you, help this place, help all the people you've been helping." James pulled out his phone. "I can set up a foundation, create permanent funding streams, ensure the shelter never faces eviction again." Rebecca's expression grew thoughtful. "That would be wonderful. But can I ask you something first?" "Of course." "When you gave me that card, you said you'd know if I was worthy of trust. What made you decide I was worthy?" James looked at this young woman who had turned his worldview upside down. "It wasn't any single thing you bought or any person you helped. It was that you never once considered yourself. In a week of unlimited resources, you never bought yourself a meal or a piece of clothing or even a candy bar. You saw that card as a tool to help others, not as a solution to your own problems." "But that's the thing," Rebecca said. "It was a solution to my problems. My problem was that I was surrounded by people who were suffering and I couldn't help them. You gave me the ability to help them. That solved my biggest problem." James felt tears he hadn't cried in 20 years threatening to fall. This girl had redefined everything he thought he knew about selfishness and generosity, about problems and solutions, about what it meant to be human. "Rebecca," he said, "would you consider working with me? Not just accepting my help, but partnering with me to create something bigger than either of us could manage alone." She studied his face carefully, and James realized she was evaluating his sincerity the same way she had probably learned to evaluate the trustworthiness of adults who had made promises to her before. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. As the sun set over Austin, James Hartford began describing a vision that had formed in his mind over the past week, a comprehensive approach to homelessness that addressed not just immediate needs but long-term solutions. Job training, permanent housing, mental health services, addiction recovery programs, and most importantly, dignity and respect for every person served. Rebecca listened, asked thoughtful questions, and gradually began to smile. By the time Pastor Tom came out to check on them, they were deep in conversation about budgets and timelines and the logistics of changing lives on a citywide scale. The test was over, but the real work was just beginning. Richard Stone burst through the doors of the Austin Emergency Shelter like a man possessed, his expensive suit and polished shoes completely out of place among the worn furniture and humble surroundings. He had tracked James's phone to this location, and what he found there made his blood boil. James was sitting at a folding table with Rebecca, Pastor Tom, and several shelter residents, surrounded by notebooks and spreadsheets. They were deep in animated conversation about construction timelines and program budgets, their heads bent together over architectural drawings for an expanded facility. James, Richard's voice cut through the room like a blade. "We need to talk. Now." Every conversation in the room stopped. Maria looked up from helping her children with coloring books. Calvin paused in his discussion with Frank Henderson, who had come by to talk about hiring more shelter residents. Old Pete and Jenny stopped playing chess in the corner. James looked up calmly. "Richard, I was wondering when you'd show up." "Outside?" Richard demanded. But James didn't move. "Anything you need to say to me, you can say in front of these people. They are going to be my partners in this new venture." Richard's face turned red with fury. "Partners? James, these people are cons and criminals. And this girl," he pointed at Rebecca, who was watching the interaction with quiet alertness. "This girl is a manipulative thief who has stolen from you." Rebecca started to stand, but James gestured for her to stay seated. "Richard, I gave Rebecca that credit card voluntarily. She's used it exactly as I hoped someone would." "She's used $50,000 of your money in a week," Richard shot back. "Money that could have been invested, could have been growing your portfolio. Instead, it's gone to feed and house people who contribute nothing to society." The room erupted in angry voices. Calvin stood up, his hands clenched. "Contribute nothing? I work 40 hours a week at Henderson's Auto. I pay taxes now." Maria joined in, her voice shaking with emotion. "I'm the receptionist at Dr. Martinez's office. I support my children and contribute to this community." But Rebecca raised a hand, and somehow a quiet gesture commanded more attention than the shouting. The room gradually fell silent. "Mr. Stone," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite her youth, "I understand why you're angry. From your perspective, I took something that belonged to your business partner and used it for people you don't know or care about." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Rebecca continued. "But here's what I think you don't understand. That money didn't disappear. It turned into Calvin having a job and a future. It turned into Maria's children having a safe place to sleep and their mother having steady income. It turned into old Pete staying alive because he can afford his insulin." Rebecca gestured around the room. "It turned into this shelter, staying open, so 68 people don't freeze on the streets." "Money should generate more money," Richard said coldly. "That's how business works, how society advances." "Money should generate hope," Rebecca replied. "That's how communities work, how people advance." James watched this exchange with growing admiration. Rebecca was holding her own against one of the most ruthless businessmen he knew, not with aggression or defensiveness, but with simple clarity about her values. Richard turned back to James, desperation creeping into his voice. "Do you hear this? This is exactly the kind of bleeding heart manipulation I warned you about. She's got you convinced that throwing money at social problems is the same as solving them." "Richard," James said quietly, "when was the last time you felt proud of something you accomplished?" The question seemed to catch Richard off guard. What kind of question is that? A simple one. When was the last time you went to bed knowing you had made someone's life better? Richard sputtered. "I make people's lives better every day. Our company employs thousands of people, generates millions in tax revenue, drives innovation." When was the last time you looked someone in the eye and saw gratitude for something you had done for them personally? The room was completely silent now. Everyone was watching James and Richard face off, but this wasn't just a business disagreement. This was a fundamental conflict about what life was supposed to be about. Richard's voice dropped to a menacing whisper. James, if you continue down this path, I will call the media. I will tell them that James Hartford has been taken in by a street con. I will make sure your reputation and your business empire are destroyed. James stood up slowly, his full height imposing in the small room. Richard, you're fired. You can't fire me. I own 40% of the company. Which means I own 60%. You're fired. Jamesy's voice was calm but absolute. Security will escort you out of all company buildings tomorrow morning. Richard's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, disbelief, and finally calculation. You'll regret this, James. When this whole charity fantasy falls apart, when these people show their true colors, when you realize you've been played by a teenage con artist, you'll regret this. He turned and stormed out of the shelter, leaving behind an awkward silence. Pastor Tom was the first to speak. James, are you sure that was wise? Running a business is complicated. Pastor Tom, James said, settling back down at the table, I've spent 20 years building a company with Richard Stone. In all that time, we never once had a conversation about making the world better. We only talked about making ourselves richer. He looked around the room at the faces surrounding him, people who had been written off by society, who had found hope through Rebecca's generosity, who were now working and contributing and rebuilding their lives. I don't want to spend the next 20 years the same way. Rebecca reached across the table and put her hand over James's. Are you sure about all this? You're giving up a lot to help people you barely know. James looked at her hand on his, then up at her face. In her eyes, he saw something he had been searching for his entire adult life without realizing it, genuine care for his well-being that wasn't connected to his money or status. Rebecca, he said, you spent a week using my money to help strangers. I figure it's time I learned to do the same. As the evening wore on, the group returned to their planning. But James found himself watching Rebecca as much as listening to the conversation. This young woman had somehow managed to teach a cynical billionaire about the true meaning of wealth. And he was beginning to realize that what he felt for her was much more than admiration for her character. The test had revealed more than human nature. It had revealed the possibility of love. 6 months later, James stood in the lobby of the newly constructed Hartford Collins Community Center, watching Rebecca address a crowd of donors, city officials, and residents whose lives had been transformed by their partnership. The building behind her was beautiful in its simplicity: clean lines, bright spaces, and walls of windows that let in natural light. But more beautiful than the architecture were the programs housed inside: job training workshops, addiction recovery support groups, childcare services for working parents, and permanent transitional housing for 50 families. When Mr. Hartford first gave me that credit card, Rebecca was saying to the assembled crowd, I thought it was just a chance to help a few people for a short time. I never imagined it would grow into something like this. James found himself smiling as he watched her speak. In 6 months, Rebecca had blossomed into a confident young woman who could command a room full of Austin's most powerful citizens. But she had never lost the essential quality that had first caught his attention: her instinctive care for others. But the real miracle isn't this building or these programs, Rebecca continued. It's what happens when people who have been written off by society get a chance to prove their worth. She gestured toward the audience, where Calvin sat with his wife. They had reunited after he got steady work in housing. Maria was there with her children, now enrolled in a good school and thriving. Old Pete, his diabetes under control, had become the center's volunteer coordinator. Jenny was 6 months into community college, studying social work. Every person you see here tonight is proof that kindness multiplies when we share it. That investment in human dignity always pays dividends. That hope is never wasted. As the crowd applauded, James felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Pastor Tom, now the center's director of spiritual care. She's something special, that girl, Pastor Tom said quietly. She is, James agreed. Sometimes I still can't believe she's real. Pastor Tom chuckled. Oh, she's real all right. Real stubborn when she thinks she's right, real demanding when it comes to standards for the programs, real protective of the people she serves. But real kind, James added. Real kind, Pastor Tom agreed. And real in love with you, though she's too scared to admit it. James's heart skipped. What makes you say that? The way she lights up when you walk into a room. The way she asks about your day even when she's exhausted from her own work. The way she defends you to anyone who suggests you're just another rich guy trying to buy good publicity. James had suspected, had hoped, but had been afraid to assume. Rebecca's background of being failed by adults had made him cautious about expressing feelings that might seem like another power imbalance. After the reception ended and the last guests had left, James found Rebecca in her office, working by lamplight on grant applications. Her desk was covered with photographs, before and after pictures of families who had moved from the streets into permanent housing, graduation photos from their job training programs, children's drawings thanking the center for helping their parents. Knock knock, James said from the doorway. Rebecca looked up and smiled. Come in. I'm just finishing the application for the State Workforce Development Grant. James settled into the chair across from her desk. Over the months, these late-night planning sessions had become their favorite time together. The building was quiet, their work was focused, and they could talk about anything. Rebecca, James said, can I ask you something personal? She set down her pen and gave him her full attention. Of course. Do you ever regret it? The way everything happened. I mean, you could have taken that credit card and built a completely different life for yourself. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. James, 6 months ago I was sleeping on a cot in a shelter, wearing clothes from donation boxes, and eating whatever food was available. I had no family, no future, no hope that things would ever be different. She gestured around her office, then out the window where the lights of Austin twinkled in the distance. Now I have meaningful work, a safe place to live, enough food to eat, and the ability to change lives every day. But more than that, I have people who care about me. Pastor Tom, Calvin, Maria, Jenny, and you. She paused, and James felt his heart rate increase. Especially you, Rebecca continued. So no, I don't regret anything. Because I ended up with something I never even knew I wanted. What's that? James asked softly. A family, a purpose, and... Rebecca hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. And love. James felt his breath catch. Rebecca. I know it's complicated, she said quickly. I know I'm young, and our backgrounds are different, and people might think it's strange. James stood up and walked around the desk, gently taking her hands in his. Rebecca, the only thing that's strange is that it took me so long to realize that I've been in love with you since the day I watched you buy groceries for people you barely knew. Her eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Really? Really? James brushed a tear from her cheek. You taught me what wealth actually means. Not the number in a bank account, but the richness of caring about other people more than yourself. Rebecca stood up and stepped closer to him. And you taught me that not all adults will let you down. That some people keep their promises and see the best in others. As James leaned down to kiss her, he thought about the test that had started all this. He had wanted to prove that everyone had a price, that human nature was fundamentally selfish. Instead, he had discovered that some people measured wealth in kindness given and received. The kiss was gentle and full of hope, tasting like the future they would build together. When they broke apart, Rebecca laughed and wiped her eyes. So what happens now? James smiled. Now we get married, expand the center to 3 more cities, and spend the rest of our lives proving that love and generosity can change the world. In that order? Rebecca asked, grinning. Definitely in that order. 2 years later, their wedding was held in the courtyard of the community center, surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives had been transformed by Rebecca's initial act of selflessness. Calvin walked Rebecca down the aisle. Maria and Jenny were her bridesmaids. Pastor Tom officiated the ceremony. In his vows, James promised to match Rebecca's generosity for the rest of his life. In her vows, Rebecca promised to help James remember that the best investments always involve the human heart. As they kissed to seal their marriage, the crowd erupted in celebration. But James barely heard the cheers and applause. He was too busy marveling at the miracle that had brought them together. A test designed to reveal the worst in human nature had instead revealed the possibility of redemption, hope, and love. The Hartford Collins Foundation now operates in 12 cities across the United States, has helped over 10,000 people transition from homelessness to stable housing and employment, and serves as a model for community-based approaches to social problems. But its greatest success story remains the love between a cynical billionaire who learned to see with his heart and a homeless teenager who taught him that true wealth is measured by the lives we touch, the hope we share, and the love we give away. Sometimes the greatest fortunes are built not with money, but with kindness. And sometimes the richest people are those who choose to make others wealthy in the ways that matter most. Their story proved that when unexpected kindness meets divine favor, when second chances meet redemption, and when hope meets love, miracles happen. The test revealed that human nature, at its core, is not selfish but generous, not greedy but giving, not cynical but hopeful, and that the greatest credit card limit of all is the infinite capacity of the human heart to care for others.